Now, for more on China's reverse migration and opportunities migrants find back home, we're joined by current affairs commentator Einar Tangen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rachelle.
Now, Einar, the number of people starting new businesses in rural China grew more than 3% year on year in the first half of 2015, and that's expected to continue. What do you think is driving this trend?
Well, there are a number of factors. First off, it's, you've heard the testimony that they said, the life in the rural areas has improved. If you really look at wages in these areas, they've tripled over the last 5 to 10 years. And this has really brought about a lot of differences in attitudes. Also, it's very difficult. Cities in China bring opportunity. In some cases, it's a great place to meet a future mate. But the pressures of life there can be very difficult. And with elderly parents at home, children who are tied to the local hukou system, it can be very, very attractive to go back and try to find another opportunity.
Now, given that people are trying to balance all these concerns, what are some of the industries that these entrepreneurs are finding opportunities in?
Well, it's a broad range. I mean, you're talking about local economies. You have to understand that when we start talking about rural areas, we're not talking about, some village of just 50 or 60 people. Most of those very, very small villages are having very, very tough times. It's the medium-sized, small rural cities and communities which are really growing. They offer a kind of a mix of things you can do, houses, apartments, etc., and economic opportunities. Remember, whenever you get a significant group of people together, 100, 150,000, all of a sudden you start to talk about shoes, clothing, furniture, all the things that go into creating this kind of rural, but rural-urban lifestyle.
And given that complexity, it can already be a struggle to get a business off the ground no matter where you live. But what are some of the unique challenges that migrant workers face?
Well, it's not that different from other places. It's about finance, having an understanding of business. This is one of the greatest problems that faces everybody world. In your South Africa segment, this issue of how do you run a business to stay current with taxes, regulations, all of these types of things, investing capital. How are you going to get that money together? So they face the same kind of situation. They have to make very, very careful decisions. Chinese are very entrepreneurial, and they see in the cities how you can do businesses, and then they're taking them back home and trying to apply those.
And now you mentioned financing, and some of the options can perhaps be local governments, rural banks, and even private investors. What are some of the pros and cons of those?
Well, as you say, I mean, this last year there was a scandal involving these rural economic cooperatives, which were operating like small banks, kind of like credit unions in essence, for the U.S. side. And unfortunately, they were pilfered. What happened is instead of investing in the rural economy, the real economy where jobs were being created and goods being done, they speculated on property and things that were unrelated to their core mission. So, this is always a challenge with a number of the institutions in China, and I think that was what Lee was talking about, this real economy versus the speculative economy. And I think the government, you'll see a lot of moves in that direction to kind of limit, put in place regulations that prevent entities from getting beyond the scope of where they should be.
Now, we've actually seen some private companies stepping in. We've seen Alibaba recently agreed to train 1 million teenagers in rural areas to help jumpstart their own e-commerce businesses, offering things like funding and partnerships. Do you think that's something that perhaps more companies will follow?
Well, I think people will be watching very carefully to see what kind of dividends. I mean, Alibaba isn't doing this purely out of social need. They're doing this as a way of developing into this. Remember, there's just tremendous amounts of people still left in the rural areas, and that kind of last mile situation and creating goods that can be sold cheaply online is very important. Remember, as wages rise in the cities, it becomes more attractive to shift certain types of industries, especially handicraft, back to these rural areas where the cost of living is relatively less.
Now, as we look at this trend and we look at the government policies that are in place to making a migrant worker come back home more easier, do you think that this trend could perhaps have an impact on closing the wealth gap and alleviating poverty?
Well, that's part of the aim. I mean, all of this is aimed at creating better lives for people in China. And a lot of it is due to this kind of shift in thinking away from this, we'll have a bunch of mega cities, to more regionally developed cities which are interconnected by small, medium, and large-sized towns and cities. They can act as a network and offer different living and economic opportunities. And I think this is really a very important trend that China has adopted over the last 3-4 years, and it marks a turning point, because instead of thinking yourself, well, I either go to the city or nothing, people really are having a much broader range of opportunities and choices that they can make.
All right, and just quickly, as we look at some of these migrant workers who are leaving these manufacturing jobs predominantly, what does that mean for the manufacturing sector? How worried should they be?
Well, everyone talks about the Lewis point, you know, the point where your labor dividend starts to go away. I mean, this last year was the first time that you saw a significant fall. Over 5 million migrant workers did not return to the cities, a net decrease. And this is sometimes troubling, but the fact is, if China is going to go ahead with supply-side economic reforms, they need to automate. So this actually comes at a good time for China, because this will be an incentive to start climbing the value chain and getting more involved in tertiary industries and production, making themselves more efficient and therefore more competitive worldwide.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Einar Tangen joining us there live from Beijing.